Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about the gangs of Calgary, Alberta. In November of 2023, Alberta Safety Minister Mike Ellis said that gang violence in the province was becoming intolerable. And this announcement by the Safety Minister may have been a little bit hyperbolic. It had been a violent week in Calgary, but that's definitely not the norm. However, Calgary has seen its share of gang activity, and I wanted to cover some of that in this video. And in this video, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. If you've watched my other gang videos, you're well aware that there's a lot of overlap. There are street gangs and motorcycle clubs that are active across the country, and I covered a bunch of them in my previous videos. But in this video, I want to talk about gangs that are exclusive to Calgary, certain groups that developed within that city specifically. For example, between 2002 and 2009, Calgary had one of the most violent open gang wars in Canadian history. And just a quick note before I begin, everything I'm presenting in this video is based on publicly available information, and this is just intended to be a general overview. And so I'm just going to jump right into the video, and I'm going to start with Calgary's most well-known gang conflict. So in the late 1990s, brothers Nick and Timothy Chan began dealing drugs, and they were supplied by their uncle, who was a prominent leader of a gang known as the Devil Boys. Nick and Timothy Chan later teamed up with a guy named Hans Jason Eastgard, and they would be involved with him for many years. And so these three guys initially started three groups. Number one, the Devil Boys under their uncle. They also started another group called the Young Dragons, and then the third group was the Tran clan, and this was led by Philip, Troy, and Jackie Tran. Sources vary on why this happened, but there was eventually a falling out between these three groups, and the Devil Boys and the Young Dragons combined to form the Fresh Off the Boat gang. And then the Tran clan teamed up with a man named Billy Lai and formed the Fresh Off the Boat Killers gang, which is shortened to FK. The first big confrontation between the two groups came in February of 2002 when members of both gangs got in a significant fight outside of a downtown Calgary karaoke bar. An FK associate named Vuthi Kong stabbed and killed Adam Mew, who was a loose associate of a Fresh Off the Boat member, and this kicked off a violent rivalry between the two gangs. In December of 2002, Fresh Off the Boat associate Jason Yoon was wounded in a drive-by shooting, and at the time he was with the Fresh Off the Boat founders Nick and Timothy Chan. Obviously, this angered the Fresh Off the Boat gang, and 6 days later, two FK members were gunned down and killed in retaliation. This budding violence led to a Calgary police initiative called Operation Synergy, which eventually resulted in 72 arrests and 319 charges against both groups. But this feud between the two gangs just continued, and they had multiple conflicts in Alberta correctional facilities, and eventually gang members had to be kept in separate institutions. And the violence just continued. In February of 2005, Fresh Off the Boat member Jonathan Fang was shot and killed at a Calgary nightclub. And between February and July of that year, 5 more people were killed in a string of shootings involving the two gangs. Law enforcement in Calgary noted that it was particularly challenging to combat these gangs because they had no clearly defined territories, and they didn't use distinct clothing, tattoos, or colors like other groups. And obviously many members of these two gangs ended up in prisons where the conflicts continued, and during this time, the Fresh Off the Boat gang allied with indigenous street gangs like Red Alert and the Alberta Warriors. And the violence on Calgary streets just continued. In 2007, a prominent Fresh Off the Boat member, Sun Nyan, was shot outside his home. And on December 31st of that year, founding FK member Mark Kim was shot dead in retaliation. 2008 was the most deadly year between the two gangs up until that point. And that year, at least 8 people were killed and multiple people were wounded in conflicts between the two groups. There was a high-profile shooting in Calgary's Chinatown that year that left 5 people wounded, including Fresh Off the Boat leader Hans Eastgard. In July of that year, Fresh Off the Boat member Roger Chin was murdered, and then the next month, FK member Kevin Anaya was killed in retaliation. On October 6 of 2008, 3 people were shot at a Calgary restaurant by Fresh Off the Boat member Nathan Zuccarado. The first victim was a guy named Kevin Sess, who was a loose associate of an FK member, but he wasn't really that involved with gang activity. And Kevin's girlfriend, Tina Kong, was also fatally shot in the head during this attack, and then things really came to a head on New Year's Eve of 2009. This was probably the most well-publicized incident that occurred between the two groups. On New Year's Eve of that year, a man named Sanjeev Man, an FK associate, was targeted at the Bolsa restaurant. Fresh Off the Boat members kidnapped another FK associate named Aaron Bendel and used him to get Sanjeev Man to the restaurant. And when they were finally in the restaurant, both Sanjeev and Aaron were shot dead by 2 masked gunmen. An innocent bystander was also killed, a man named Kenny Sue, Tua, and this guy had no gang affiliation at all. This led to Calgary police launching Operation Destino, which was the biggest gang investigation in the force's history and led to the arrests of many gang members. And during this operation, they managed to get Rial Honorio to admit to his role in the Bolsa shootings. These police operations were effective in ending most of the violence between the two gangs, but shortly after, Fresh Off the Boat founder Nick Chan was repeatedly stabbed and FK leader Billy Lai was charged in the attack. Nick Chan would eventually be charged with first-degree murder, drug trafficking, and weapon possession and sent to prison in 2013. He was eventually acquitted of his role in the Bolsa shooting due to lack of a credible testimony. The prosecution appealed this and Nick Chan was tried again in 2019, but once again he was acquitted of the charges. But things didn't exactly die down for Nick after this point. In 2002, he was shot multiple times in a Calgary alley. No one really knows where Nick's brother Timothy Chan is. He's still at large, and Calgary police have even asked Interpol for help in locating him. And then fairly recently, on October 7th of 2022, Fresh Off the Boat member Trong Nyan was shot and killed outside his home in Langdon, Alberta. He had recently spent time in prison for attempting to murder a member of the FK gang. And during the conflicts between these two gangs, there was another gang that was involved at the time. They were called the 403 Soldiers, and they were allied with the Fresh Off the Boat gang during their gang wars. One of the guys I previously mentioned, Rial Honorio, who was convicted of murder in the Bolsa shootings, was a member of the 403 Soldiers. And besides being allied with the Fresh Off the Boat gang, this group was also allegedly making plans to plant explosives in the homes of rival gang members. And so after the dust had settled, this conflict between these two groups led to the bloodiest gang war in Calgary's history. And so the significant conflict between these two groups really stands out when you're talking about gang activity in this region. I also wanted to mention another gang that has been active in Calgary recently, and this group was called The Family, and it was led by Lawrence Orber from 2015 to 2020. Authorities estimate that the Family gang had about 500 members, and they were involved in prostitution and drug trafficking. I read court documents that showed that Lawrence Orber recruited a homeless woman to sell drugs to a homeless encampment near the Calgary drop-in center, and this gang became known for selling single doses of drugs to vulnerable, addicted homeless Calgarians, as well as coercing vulnerable women into prostitution. Orber was arrested in 2020 and sentenced to 10 years in prison in November of 2023, but in July of 2024 he was given an additional 6.5 more years on top of his sentence. And I hate to do this, but I have to briefly mention the CYS gang, otherwise known as Calgary's Youngest Savages. You definitely see a lot of their graffiti around Calgary, but they're just not really taken that seriously as a gang. Now I want to talk about a group called the Aryan Guard. Some people don't consider them a gang, rather a political movement, but they have been classified a criminal activity group by authorities, and for good reason. The Aryan Guard was established in Calgary in 2006 by a guy named Kyle McKee, who has been described as a micro-Führer. Kyle McKee spent his upbringing bouncing between foster homes and jails, and early on he adopted an interest in neo-Nazi ideologies. And so he formed this white power group, and he would recruit people online, and he even offered his apartment to new members. National Post journalist Brent Gunlock interviewed McKee, and he described him as being a true believer and very sincere in his beliefs. This journalist said that Kyle McKee truly believed that his opinions and actions were justified. In 2007, the Aryan Guard began distributing flyers with anti-immigration messages on them, and some of these flyers were covertly placed in the free Calgary arts and culture newspaper called Fast Forward Weekly. And the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies thought that the person truly responsible for these flyers was a man named Bill Noble. He was a neo-Nazi known by law enforcement for his online racist activism, and he had been charged in the past with willful promotion of hatred. And it turned out that the Aryan Guard's website at the time was registered in Bill Noble's name. There was a human rights discussion in Calgary at the Glenbow Museum on August 14th of 2007 where the Aryan Guard and their flyers was discussed. And at this meeting, Police Inspector Bob Couture stated that although the flyers were disturbing, there was not enough basis to take legal action against the group. In response to this, protesters held a rally in support of Calgary's multiculturalism and opposition to racism and racist movements. And of course, some members of the Aryan Guard held their own counter-protest. Later that year, on October October 14th, 15 Aryan Guard members protested at Calgary City Hall, and they were vastly outnumbered by counter-protesters, and eventually police had to intervene between the two groups. On March 21st of 2008, 40 Aryan Guard protesters squared off against 200 anti-racist protesters who were blocking the Aryan Guard from reaching their planned meeting place at the Mawada Armory. Calgary police then formed a barrier between the two groups and escorted the Aryan Guard up the steps of City Hall, where members waved flags that proclaimed white pride worldwide. As the heated demonstration died down, police escorted Aryan Guard members to a waiting school bus where they were evacuated from the scene. On March 21st of 2009, the Aryan Guard held another white pride rally in downtown Calgary where they clashed with anti-racist counter-protesters. On July 27th of 2008, a 17-year-old Aryan Guard member assaulted a Japanese woman who was leaving a Calgary bar. He was later convicted of this assault on March 13th of 2009. And then things really came to a head on the morning of November 21st of 2009 when 2 homemade bombs were left on the doorstep of Tyler Stirrup, who was a member of the Western European bloodline. The police were monitoring the situation, and these devices were eventually found and removed before detonating by the police. And Kyle McKee was charged with attempted murder, but those charges were later dropped, although he did plead guilty eventually to possessing explosives. And this really led to the demise of the Aryan Guard in an official capacity. On November 24th of 2009, the Aryan Guard officially announced its disbandment on its website. But that wasn't really the end of Kyle McKee. He later went on to associate with the Alberta chapter of UK-based Blood and Honor, and authorities state that McKee held a fairly prominent position within this chapter, although it was unclear how connected this Alberta chapter was to the UK parent group. Around this time, there was a man named Richard Warman who was a human rights lawyer, and he was quoted as saying, "Alberta right now is the hotspot for the neo-Nazi movement in Canada." And even after the Aryan Guard officially disbanded, their members were involved in other violent events. On March 24th of 2012, Kyle McKee, along with Philip Badrock and Bernard Miller, assaulted 2 East Indian men as they were leaving a liquor store in Edmonton. And then honestly, in recent times, neo-Nazi and white supremacist activity has died down, but there's always going to be organizations out there that adhere to these ideologies. Now, all of these gangs that I've talked about have been fairly recent, but I wanted to go back in time and talk about some gangs that have existed in Calgary in the past. First off, when I was talking about the gang war in the 2000s between the Fresh Off the Boat and the Fresh Off the Boat Killers gangs, I mentioned that Nick and Timothy Chan initially started out dealing drugs under their uncle in the Devil Boys gang. The Devil Boys were mainly made up of Vietnamese men, and they were active in the 1980s and the 1990s in Calgary, and they were heavily involved in weapons smuggling, illegal gambling, prostitution, and drug distribution. There was a fairly significant conflict in 1992 between the Devil Boys and another unnamed gang. During this conflict, both sides would fly in reinforcements from Vancouver and Toronto, and here are some of the major events in that conflict in 1992. On May 1st, police got word that a former Devil Boy was back in Calgary from Toronto, and that the gang had made it known that it was going to try to take over control of the city's prostitution and drug trade. That same day, the Devil Boys attacked a rival gang member, and they even inflicted a 70-stitch cut to his face. A few days later, on May 4th, there were 2 separate altercations between the Devil Boys and this other group at 2 different restaurants in Calgary. And during these conflicts, a member of the Devil Boys was shot in the leg. The next day, on May 6th, in retaliation, the Devil Boys did a drive-by shooting at the home of a rival gang member. No one was injured in the shooting. That same day, 3 men flew into Calgary from Toronto as reinforcements for the other gang, and 4 Devil Boys were arrested after being caught with an illegal handgun. The next day, on May 7th, the Devil Boys did another drive-by shooting at the same house of that rival gang member, and again, this time there were no injuries. And again, later that same day, another 2 people flew in from Toronto to reinforce the other gang. Also on May 7th, an informant told police that the second gang was now in possession of 2 machine guns, and they were preparing to wipe out the Devil Boys. Police are also told that the Devil Boys have a machine gun, and they're planning on doing the same thing to the other gang. The next day, on May 8th, police detectives would actually approach gang leaders on both sides to suggest a peaceful sit-down where they could resolve things. And although both sides seemed receptive, nothing really came of this. The next day, on May 9th, members of the second gang misidentified someone at a restaurant as a member of the Devil Boys and shot him in the face. Fortunately, this person survived. On May 13th, police get word that approximately 30 people have flown in from Vancouver and Toronto to reinforce both sides. The police as well as the greater community, especially Calgary's Chinatown, are concerned that an all-out gang war is soon to erupt. On May 23rd, the owner of a downtown restaurant is assaulted and shoots a devil boy in the neck with a pellet gun. The gang member was arrested by police, and of course the restaurant owner expressed concerns of retaliation. On May 24th, a member of the second gang flies to Vancouver to get even more reinforcements. And the next day, the wife of a leader of the second gang flew to Toronto with their children because everything was heating up and they felt it was safer to do so. On May 28th, the restaurant owner who shot the devil boy member receives 2 death threats, and once again the police are involved. Also on May 28th, police detectives are contacted by the leader of the second gang, and he told them that both sides were now willing to sit down and negotiate a settlement. The police were actually asked by both sides to attend this meeting, as both sides felt this may be a trap. The next day, on May 29th, the first meeting between the two groups took place at the Blue Sky Karaoke, with many police officers present outside to prevent any ambushes. 5 minutes before the meeting began, police received word that it was a setup and that a drive-by shooting was planned. The police would call in more units, but no drive-by shooting occurred, and the meeting concluded an hour later with no settlement. The two gangs would meet a couple more times, and by the end of their last meeting, both gangs had settled on a truce between them. The only stumbling block was that the Devil Boys insisted on killing the restaurant owner who had shot one of their members with a pellet gun. But the second gang said that the truce would be off if the owner was harmed or killed. On May 30th, another meeting between the rival gangs was arranged with the restaurant owner present. The Devil Boys asked for $2,000 in cash and $20,000 in cash when one of their members got out of jail. And on June 1st, the police said that they believed the restaurant owner did pay the Devil Boys the $2,000 in cash, but they weren't able to lay extortion charges since he didn't cooperate with the police. And so Asian-based gangs have been very established and active in Calgary for quite some time. And then going back a few years, I actually found a 1989 article where the Calgary police talked about a number of other Asian gangs that were active in the city. They talked about the Young Dragons, who had about 20 members, and they allegedly committed property offenses and intimidated students and local businesses. They also mentioned the Rude Boys, a Vietnamese group with about 60 members, and they were said to be involved in property offenses, robberies, extortion, prostitution, and street-level drug trafficking. There was also mention of a group called Kung Lok, and they allegedly had about 65 members who were involved in drug distribution, robberies, extortion, theft, and prostitution. I also found another article from 1986 where it talked about Calgary police being aware of triad gangs being established in the city. And so it's clear that overall Calgary has had a very prominent Asian gang influence throughout its history. And then I also wanted to mention a couple motorcycle clubs that had their origins in the city of Calgary. First off, you have to mention the Grim Reapers Motorcycle Club. This was an outlaw club that was founded in Calgary all the way back in 1967, and they grew to become a very dominant club in the region between the 1980s and 1990s. But apparently they were not associated with the Grim Reapers Motorcycle Club of the United States. And of course they had many conflicts with other groups. In 1970, 11 members and 2 associates of the Grim Reapers were sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Ronald Hartley, who was president of the Outcast Motorcycle Club. And of course they were involved in everything from drug trafficking to murder to assault and extortion. They were closely allied with the Hells Angels, and some of their rivals included the King's Crew, who I'll talk about in a second, as well as the Rebels, the Outcasts, and the Warlords. And then in 1997, the Grim Reapers became part of the Hells Angels in a patchover ceremony held in Red Deer, Alberta. And then you also had the King's Crew Motorcycle Club, who I just mentioned. This was another outlaw club that was started in Calgary, and they were founded in 1977. And until they also joined the Hells Angels in the late 90s, they were involved in many conflicts with other clubs. For example, in June of 1983, a member of the Grim Reapers killed a member of the King's Club by booby-trapping his vehicle with an explosive. And they were involved in the same criminal activities as the other outlaw groups in the area. The King's Crew were allied with the Rebels Motorcycle Club. The Rebels were actually started in Red Deer, and I think I'm going to do a separate video on them down the road because they have a very interesting history as well. And then the King's Crew had fierce rivalries with the Grim Reapers as well as the Warlocks. And I gave you a prominent example, but they were also involved in many other conflicts around Calgary. And so that was just a general overview, and I could probably go deeper into some of these subjects in future videos. But as you can see, Calgary's gang history goes back many decades. And that pretty much wraps up this video. I just wanted to focus on criminal groups that are unique to Calgary, that had their origins within that city. Obviously, there are larger street gangs and motorcycle clubs that have been involved in criminal activity and are active across the country, including Calgary. This is going to be the last gang video I'm going to post for a couple weeks. I do plan on on doing gang videos for the larger cities in Canada like Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, but I want to take my time and do a lot more research for those just because they're much larger cities with a much more complex gang history. I'm also really looking forward to some videos I'm working on regarding some historic crime stories within Canada, including some that deal with Canada's involvement with American mafia groups in the past. And so I'm really looking forward to some of these future videos, and I'm sure you'll find them interesting as well. If you haven't watched them yet, I've already posted gang videos on Edmonton, Saskatchewan, and Winnipeg, and I'm looking forward to doing more down the road. I hope you found that interesting and informative, and if you'd like to watch more of my content in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload about one new video per week. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.